Good evening.
Good evening, Father.
Is this working okay? Don't hear much up here. As I've mentioned before, the little way consists of several elements which we've been looking at. If you skip one, it's not the little way. It might have some real merit, but it's not the little way. If you misunderstand one, and it's not the little way, it's a distortion. And it's easy enough to do. St. Theresa wrote her autobiography at the request of her religious superior, which was also at that time her own older sister, the one she called Little Mother. And it was written for their, I guess, somewhat entertainment, but also because they saw she had a wonderful memory of the past. And she had a wonderful way to express herself. So her sister asked her to do it. So she wrote it for them. She knew that she did not have to qualify a lot of her statements, that they understood well. They're Carmelite sisters. They knew. But outside of the convent and Catholicism, her little way can be misunderstood, especially when it's not studied in context. So, I'd like to look at this statement made by one of St. Teresa's novices, that she was assistant novice mistress, which means she forms novices for the Carmelite religious life, to form them in the spirituality of the Carmelites. So she had that responsibility. And one of Sister Teresa's novices, as one of Sister Teresa's novices, Maria of the Trinity, had the opportunity to hear from her mouth, St. Teresa's mouth, an important explanation on what she called the little way of love and confidence. I, that's Maria of the Trinity, had made her aware of my intention to teach this spiritual doctrine to my parents and friends. There's the missionary dimension. See how it comes? Oh, she said to me, pay very close attention while I am explaining it to you, because our little way, poorly understood, could be taken for quietism, which was a heresy, or Illuminism. She then explained to me these false doctrines unknown to me. I remember that she mentioned Mrs. Gaillon as heretical. Don't believe. A heretic, by the way, is someone who disbelieves one or more doctrines of the Catholic faith that we are required to believe. Don't believe, she said to me, that to follow the way of love is to follow a way of rest, all of sweetness and consolations. It is very much the opposite. To offer oneself as a victim to love is to surrender oneself without reserve to the divine good pleasure. It is to expect to share with Jesus his humiliations and his chalice of bitterness. Remember when the apostles James and John wanted, through the mother, wonderful mother, she asked Jesus on their behalf if these two wonderful disciples of the Lord could sit at his right and his left in the kingdom. And he asked them, can you drink of the chalice of which I have to drink? And they didn't know what they were saying. They said, yes, we can. And he said, you will. You will. And they did, with his grace. The following is another beautiful image of the little way. And I cite this as it includes a warning not to think of the little way as the way of mediocrity or negligence, covered by the excuse, I'm just a little ne'er-do-well. Don't expect much from me. I'm not capable of anything much. Just leave me alone. One of the novices, greatly discouraged at the thought of her imperfections, tells us that her mistress, Saint Theresa, spoke to her as follows: You make me think of a little child that is learning to stand, but it does not yet know how to walk. In his desire to reach the top of the stairs, to find his mother, he lifts his little foot to climb the first stair. It is all in vain, and at each renewed effort he fails. Well, be like that little child. Always keep lifting your foot to climb the ladder of holiness, and do not imagine that you can mount even the first step. All God asks of you is goodwill. From the top of the ladder, he looks lovingly upon you, and soon, touched by your fruitless efforts, he will himself come down and, taking you in his arms, will carry you to his kingdom, never again to leave him. But should you cease, there's the key, should you cease to raise your foot, in other words, try, you will be left for a long time on earth. Till you learn that lesson. I add that. Till you learn. All God asks of you is your goodwill, she says. That is very rich. To give you an example, I met someone who was invited to come and meet with me by one of my parishioners, and she knew him. I don't think he was Catholic, but he was suffering greatly and was considering suicide because his sufferings were so great. And he came to see me, and in the course of our conversation, I tried to find out, what all was his situation. And I became convinced that he was carrying a very, very heavy cross. And he said that he felt like he was totally, it's just like St. Theresa would say, totally without strength, total weakness, didn't have any strength left. He was talking like that. And he said, I don't think I don't have any strength. And I said, well, you feel weak, but you are not. I think you're lifting the equivalent of 500 pounds. And if you know the great weightlifters lift that kind of weight. I'm telling you that. I don't think I said that to him. I think you're lifting 500 pounds. And yeah, you feel like you can't take it one more second. He said he felt so weak. I said, you're not. You're very strong. And so the same thing with the little child lifting its foot. It can't climb the stairs, but it tries. There's the key, it tries. And using the weight example, 50 pounds for a child is the same as 300 pounds for an adult, and the child is trying to lift the 50 pounds. So the little way is really trying. It is really trying. You're not lifting much. Nothing that would get in the history books. But it's heavy for you. And we all, getting practical, every one of us has a cross, or we're throwing it down. I don't know. It's up to all of us. Or we're carrying it half the time. We all have our cross, our daily duties. Our daily duties are our cross. And we need to see them as what we can do to show our love for God and neighbor, to do them as well as we can. And that again means as well as we can, really as well as we can. 50 pounds for a child. If that's all you can lift, truly all you can lift, you're doing well. It's equivalent to me to 300 for an adult that can do it. What's the difference? It's the limit of their strength. What's the difference? There is no difference. In the eyes of God, there is no difference. If a person is doing all they can do, truly, it doesn't matter how much it is. It doesn't matter at all. It's their will he looks at. St. Theresa suffered a lot as a child. I was mentioning she has this beautiful holy family, but that does not mean in any way they were exempt from suffering. They weren't. Let's look at Theresa's suffering. That our Lord willed for her to make her into what he wanted her to be, to mold her as the potter molds the clay. Her mother died she was 4.5 years old. It was a blow to her. It changed her personality. That's a pretty good blow, to change a personality. Here's a suffering she experienced when the new mother, she called it her older sister, Pauline, became her little mother from 4.5 on. And when she found out that Pauline was going to leave to go into the Carmelite convent, here's what happened. And I was about to lose my second mother. How can I express the anguish of my heart? In one instant, I understood what life was. Until then, I had never seen it so sad. But it appeared to me in all its reality, and I saw it was nothing but a continual suffering and separation. I shed bitter tears because I did not yet understand the joy of sacrifice. I was weak, so weak that I consider it a great grace to have been able to support a trial that seemed to be far above my strength. It was as if a sword were buried in my heart. And then she ended up later with a mysterious illness that caused her to go into delirium. And she was thought to be potentially to die from this as a child. I can't describe this strange sickness, but now, she's speaking from the time of being in the religious life, I am now convinced it was the work of the devil. For a long time after my care, however, I believed I had become ill on purpose. That was another thought he was able to torment her with, that she became ill on purpose. And this was a real martyrdom for my soul. I told Marie, this was her oldest sister. I told Marie this, and with her usual kindness, she reassured me. I told it too in confession, and my confessor tried to calm me, saying that it was not possible to pretend an illness to the extent that I had been ill. God, willing no doubt to purify and especially to humble me, left me with this interior martyrdom until my entrance into Carmel, where the Father of all our souls, as with a wave of his hand, removed all my doubts. Then it's gone forever. With a wave of his hand. That's why she saw herself so much in the hands of God, because it disappeared like that. Since then, I am perfectly calm. I believe the devil had received an external power over me, but was not allowed to approach my soul, nor my mind, except to inspire me with the very great fears of certain things. For example, very simple remedies they tried in vain to make me accept. But although God permitted the devil to come near me, he also sent me visible angels. Marie was always at my bedside, taking care of me and consoling me with a mother's tenderness. Here's the little way. She learned it from her sisters. Never did she show the slightest sign of annoyance. And I still gave her a lot of trouble. Not even allowing her to be away from me. She had to go and eat her meals with Papa, but I never stopped calling her all the time she was away. I have to make another note to qualification. I like qualifications. Never take the attitude that since suffering is so beneficial in the divine plan, that we can leave the person suffering alone. While it is true that God uses suffering to perfect the soul, it is part of that perfection to do what we can to help others that are suffering. What we can. In fact, our salvation depends on that. Because I heard someone a long time ago mocking it, the idea of suffering being valuable. It was on the radio, and he was saying, oh, it's so wonderful, just why don't we increase it? He didn't understand. He was paying attention to really Christ's death on the cross either. No, we try to, it's our job to decrease it. And not to be a cause of suffering for others, especially, though we will at times. And just remember the parable of the sheep and the goats. I was hungry and you gave me no food, or you did give me food. I was sick and in prison and you visited me, or you didn't. No, we can never be indifferent to suffering just because suffering does good for souls. This is about her desire to suffer. She was prepared by desires from our Lord. The day after my communion, the words of Marie, because Marie prepared her for communion, came to mind. I felt born within my heart a great desire to suffer, and at the same time the interior assurance that Jesus reserved a great number of crosses for me. I felt myself flooded with consolation so great. So she did experience consolation with the little way. But she said, let's not imagine, in the first part, don't imagine it's just pleasant. But she did experience consolations, and here's an example. I felt myself flooded with consolation, so great that I look upon them as one of the greatest graces in my life. Suffering became my attraction. It had charms about it, which ravished me without my understanding them very well. Up until this time, I had suffered without loving suffering. But since this day, I felt a real love for it. I also felt the desire of loving only God and finding my joy only in Him. Often during my communions, I repeated these words of the Imitation of Christ, that great book. O Jesus, unspeakable sweetness, change all the consolations of this earth into bitterness for me. This prayer fell from my lips without effort, without constraint. It seemed I repeated it not with my will, but like a child who repeats the words of a person he loves, who has inspired it in him. Now she has another trial, another cross, scruples. Scruples are when a person sees sin where there isn't, in their own life. When you see sin in everybody else's life, that's not scruples. That's another problem. But when we see it in our own life, in our own efforts, in our own actions, where there isn't. And St. Theresa was subjected to scruples at a young age. Here's what she says. It was during my retreat for the second communion, so she's really young, that I was assailed by the terrible sickness of scruples. One would have to pass through this martyrdom to understand it well. And for me to express what I suffered for a year and a half would be impossible. All my simple thoughts and actions became the cause of trouble for me. And I had relief only when I told them to Marie. This cost me dearly, for I believed I was obliged to tell her the absurd thoughts I had even about her. She doesn't go into it, which is prudent. Because if you know what she's referring to, that'd be pretty nasty. As soon as I laid down my burden, I experienced peace for an instant, but this peace passed away like a lightning flash, and soon my martyrdom began over again. What patience, little way, what patience my dear Marie needed to listen to me without showing any annoyance. And in reality, I had only Marie, and she was indispensable to me, and that's true, by the way, so to speak. I told my scruples only to her, and was so obedient that my confessor never knew my ugly malady. I told him just the number of sins Marie permitted me to confess. Not one more. And could pass as being the least scrupulous soul on earth, in spite of the fact that I was scrupulous to the highest degree. St. Ignatius deals with, he suffered from it as well. And he says, that it actually can be, makes sense that the Lord would allow it. It can be very purifying. But he also pointed out, and he knew how to deal with it. And I'll share this secret with you from St. Ignatius. It's not mine, St. Ignatius. And he knew what he was talking about. He lived it, and he dealt with it, and he treated it. Obey your confessor. He said the person with scruples does not want to listen to their confessor. And one confessor, by the way. One. Listen to your confessor. Obey him. Because he said if the person also is suffering from, well, I shouldn't say suffering, if the person has pride, they won't listen. They will say things like, he doesn't know what I'm talking about. When, in fact, we're trained, We're trained. But in any event, listen to your confessor, obey your confessor. He said if they won't, then you're going to stay in scruples for a very long time. Or whatever the problem is. There's other problems too. And a person will stay there until what do they learn? Humility. Look at St. Therese. She obeyed her sister. I was so obedient to my sister. She permitted me to confess. I told him, the confessor, only the number of sins Marie permitted me to confess, not one more. That is the way out. But if a person tries to be their own doctor, then they're going to stay there until they learn humility and obedience. Marie was wonderful for her sister, but her sister was awesome to listen to her older sister. She didn't have to. Remember, she had the temptations not to listen. It's part of it. The little way, continuing. I made a resolution to give myself up more than ever to a serious and mortified life. When I say mortified, this is not to give the impression that I performed acts of penance. Alas, I never made any. Far from resembling beautiful souls who practiced every kind of mortification from their childhood, I have no attraction for this. Undoubtedly, this stemmed from my cowardliness, for I could have, like Celine, her other sister, found 1,000 ways of making myself suffer. Penances, in other words. Instead of this, I allowed myself to be wrapped in cotton wool and fattened up like a little bird that needs no penance. My mortifications, now she did mortify, consisted in breaking my will, which is the whole point of any other mortification. A mortification that doesn't break your will is worthless. Don't bother. If you can fast for 40 days and 40 nights and be proud, don't bother. You're wasting your time. Might make you proud. There's a famous story of that. There was a man, he said, Father Chizak, he said that he could outfast anybody in the seminary. He was a Jesuit priest, being trained for Jesuit priest. And he says, I could outfast anybody in the seminary. Ooh, I was a little proud of it. But he didn't realize it. Pride hides very well in all of us. And then he thought he would do something very heroic. He would go off to the Soviet Union and work with the underground church. And he was captured by the KGB within 2 weeks. It wasn't a very good job. And then he was put in the famous prison, and they scared him. And they got him to agree to confess that he was a Vatican spy. He was terrified, like St. Peter. And then that night he wept like St. Peter. Now he's humiliated. Now he learns to rely on God. Now he learns the little way. And the next day after he'd agreed, they were all set to have him, sign documents. He said no. And they were going to kill him. He said no. They didn't kill him. They just sent him to Siberia for the next 23 years. And he did a great job up there. Everything the Lord sends your way, you all have things in your path. Everything he sends your way, he learned that. Everything that comes my way is from the Lord. It's what I do with it that's so important. Do I let him have his way? So that's a great story too. My mortification, St. Theresa says, consisted in breaking my will, always so ready to impose himself on others, and holding back a reply, and rendering little services without any recognition, and not leaning my back against the support when seated, etc., etc. And it was the practice of these nothings. It was in the practice of these nothings that I prepared myself to become the fiancé of Jesus. I call the little way of thorns. The path of 1,000 thorns. It's my own idea of what she says, my understanding, my image. Because she didn't do anything that would get, the attention of the newspapers. Not until her autobiography is written. Don't misunderstand. She was totally unknown in her life. Even her sisters were astonished at what they saw in her soul when they read her autobiography. They did not realize the depth of what was going on. No, she was unknown in her life, even in her convent, to a pretty good extent. So a sister broke her jug. They didn't have that many things, but it broke her jug. And Theresa was thought by the novice mistress to be the one that did it, and wasn't asked, did you do it, but was thought to be the one, and she accepted it as a penance, as if she had done it. She didn't say she did, she didn't lie. She just took it as a penance not to defend herself in this case. I applied myself to practicing little virtues, not having the capacity to practice the great. For instance, I love to fold up the mantles forgotten by the sisters, and to render them all sorts of little services. Love for mortification was given me, and this love was all the greater because I was allowed nothing by way of satisfying it. She wasn't allowed to do these things. Her ideas. The only little mortification I was doing while still in the world was consisting, she mentioned this already, of not leaning my back against any support while seated. It was forbidden me in the convent because of my inclination to stoop. Also, my ardor for penances would not have lasted long had the superiors allowed them. The penances they did allow me consisted in mortifying my self-love. The Carmelite, when she says it didn't have much to do, she did actually. She really did. The Carmelite way of life was penitential. But she had ideas and desires for greater penances, I suppose, at times. But not too great, because that would violate her little way anyway. That she was beginning to learn. She didn't know it from the beginning, She learned it and formulated it over time through her experiences that God showed her. So the penances they did allow me consisted in mortifying my self-love, which did me more good than corporeal penances, bodily penances, like fasting for 40 days or something. Later on, she said, I don't desire any longer suffering or death. I still love them both. It is love alone that attracts me, however. I desired them for a long time. I possess suffering and believe I touched the shores of heaven, and the little flower would be gathered in the springtime of her life. Now abandonment alone guides me. That means whatever the Lord wills, whatever he wants. I don't have a preference. I have no other compass, she says. I can no longer ask for anything with fervor. This is later on as she has really grown mature. Except the accomplishment of God's will in my soul, without any creatures being able to set obstacles in the way. How sweet is the way of love, dear Mother, Pauline. True, one can fall or commit infidelities, but knowing how to draw profit from everything, love quickly consumes everything that can be displeasing to Jesus. That's back to love covers a multitude of sins. So if you're a great sinner here, really great, love covers a multitude of sins. It leaves nothing but a humble and profound peace in the depths of the heart. And I remember I've said before, she had initially, early on, she had desires to be a martyr. And like Joan of Arc and like all these martyrs, she wanted to be like all of them. And then later on, you may be aware, and I won't go into it, but she suffered a trial of faith. And what that means is she had trouble believing in the existence of heaven, God, anything. That didn't mean she didn't believe it, but she had trouble believing it. It was now hard. For a while, heaven was a source of consolation. But when the dark night of the Spirit strikes, I shouldn't say strikes, if a person is obedient enough to God's will, that they allow him to purify their souls in the depths, then he will. And what he was doing is purifying her faith, like he does with many saints. But she got no consolation out of the thought of heaven, and it became a source of suffering, just the thought of heaven. And she was tempted by all sorts of attacks on the idea of faith. All sorts of attacks came into her mind, probably from Satan, telling her that there is nothing. All your sufferings are waste. Go ahead if you want, but when you're dead, it won't even matter. She said the worst arguments of all the rationalists came into her mind. Everything will be explained by science. Everything. Everything's going to be explained by science. Just wait long enough. Here's how she dealt with in charity. Charity sometimes is a penance too, obviously, being charitable. This explains the little way of thorns. Lord, I know you don't command the impossible. You know better than I do my weakness and imperfection. You know very well that I never would be able to love my sisters in the convent as you love them, unless you, my Jesus, love them in me. It is because you wanted to give me this grace that you made your new commandment, which is we are to love one another as he has loved us. Oh, how I love this new commandment, since it gives me the assurance that your will is to love in me all those you command me to love. Yes, I feel it when I am charitable. It is Jesus alone, here's her humility, it is Jesus alone who is acting in me. And the more united I am to him, the more also do I love my sisters. When I wish to increase this love in me, and when especially the devil tries to place before the eyes of my soul the faults of such and such sister, who is less attractive to me, I hasten to search out her virtues, her good intentions. I tell myself that even if I did see her fall once, she could easily have won a great number of victories, which she is hiding through humility. And that even what appears to me to be a fault can very easily be an act of virtue because of her intention. In other words, she's trying. She's trying. We don't know how hard a person is trying. Unless we know them well. Then we might have an idea. But usually, we don't know them that well. I have no trouble in convincing myself of this truth because of a little experience which showed me we must never judge. And it was where she was misjudged, and she actually was trying to do something very penitential, and she was judged for being ungenerous, not generous. And it made her think, wow, this could happen to anyone. She speaks about a battle in her heart with a sister who was by character very disagreeable to her. Because sometimes there are personalities that just clash with ours. And that's not any fault of anybody necessarily anyway. Frequently, when I was at recreation, that's the time period that religious have for, amusements of some sort or another. And then she says here, I mean during work periods. So I'm not clear on what she means by that. It's one or the other, or maybe she's being humorous. I don't know, because she's very humorous, but I don't know if this is the case of that. And had occasion to work with the sister that she finds difficult. I used to run away like a deserter whenever my struggles became too violent. And she was absolutely unaware of my feelings for her. Never did she suspect the motives for my conduct. And she remained convinced that her character was very pleasing to me. One day at recreation, she asked in almost these words, "Would you tell me, Sister Theresa of the Child Jesus, what attracts you so much toward me? Every time you look at me, I see you smile." What attracted me was Jesus hidden in the depths of her soul. Jesus who makes sweet what is most bitter. I answered that I was smiling because I was happy to see her. And then she qualifies. It is understood that I did not add that this was from a spiritual standpoint. She was truly happy from a spiritual standpoint, not on a natural level. That is the little way. Practice of charity, whether you see the fruits or not. She had this understanding that the Lord said, be kind to those who are not your friends. You know, what merit do you have if you are only kind to your friends? Sinners do that. Well, she took that seriously, and there was a sister that was very old and had a lot of pain and health problems, but she was very, very particular and crotchety, I guess we would say. And Sister Therese, she's describing it here, but I won't go into it. It'll take a little too long. I wish I could, because it's a terrific story. But Sister Therese finds out that the infirmarians who normally took care of this sister were not able to because too many people were sick in the convent. So Theresa offered to take care of her, and she says, I was afraid of this. This was going to be tough. She knew it. So she volunteered, and then the sister didn't want her because she thought, oh no, this is a young one. This is a young sister. Oh no. She's not going to do what needs to be done. Because she was afraid of falling. And rightly so. The elderly, when they fall, can be rough. So she was very, very particular towards anybody who... And the other sisters nobody wanted to handle Sister St. Pierre. You were picking up a little tiger. And you would do your penance, but good, with this one. And, again, the other sister was suffering. Theresa tried to see that she was suffering from her arthritis or whatever all her problems were, her fears. And so St. Theresa worked very, very hard to please her. And it was very hard to please her. Nothing was really right for her. But she succeeded. And she even went a step further. She saw that Sister St. Pierre had trouble cutting her bread, and she offered to do that for her. And then, at that point, she won her heart. Because I think everybody else was probably anxious to leave as soon as they had done what they had to do. Little way. Very difficult. She said she found it very difficult to do this. Hard. Very much against her natural desires. But she said she experienced a great joy, so she did have a consolation from this. A great joy from it. Other occasions when she did penitential things like this, little things that people wouldn't think much of necessarily, but cost her a lot, she would feel no consolation. She did it either way because she was doing it for our Lord, ultimately. And she was doing it out of love for her sisters. My dear mother, she says to Pauline, you can see that I am a very little soul and I can offer to God only very little things. It often happens that I allow these little sacrifices which give such peace to the soul to slip by, so she doesn't get everything. But this does not discourage me, for I put up with having a little less peace and I try to be more vigilant the next time. And then she goes into some very difficult sufferings towards the end of her life with the tuberculosis. She had nightmares. She said see if I can find... Here's a suffering. In the state of weakness in which I actually am, I wonder what would become of me if I were to see a huge spider on my bed. Well, I still want to accept this fear for the sake of God. But she does ask for help to her sister. But would you ask the Blessed Virgin not to allow this to happen? She had a real phobia of spiders. Again, we wouldn't know that unless she told us. And she told her sister here. And she asked asked the Blessed Virgin not to let this happen. Perhaps I'm losing my wits. Oh, if they only knew the weakness I'm experiencing. Last night I couldn't take it anymore. I begged the Blessed Virgin to hold my head in her hands so that I could take my sufferings. The little child is lifting all 50 pounds now. But I'm only suffering for an instant. It's because we think of the past and the future that we become discouraged and fall into despair. She said that's what she recommends for everyone. Do not think of the future sufferings you may have. Only think of each moment. Don't think of the past. You can fall into despair. Don't do it. She said to me on one of those last days of her suffering, "Oh, Mother, it is very easy to write beautiful things about suffering, but writing is nothing. Nothing. One must suffer in order to know. This is her sister. I had retained a painful impression from this statement of hers when, that same day, appearing to remember what she told me, she looked at me and with a very special and solemn way pronounced these words. I really feel now that what I've said and written is true about everything. It is true that I wanted to suffer much for God's sake. And it's true that I still desire this." Someone said, "It's frightful what you are suffering." She said, "No, it's not frightful. A little victim of love cannot find frightful what her spouse sends her through love." So that's another way of handling suffering. You see her ways of handling it. She's saying, it's coming from my spouse. I accept it. Gave her strength to constantly see this as coming from her spouse. Our Lord never asks of us for sacrifices that are beyond our strength. She's speaking to her seminarian brother, priest. Well, someday will be a priest, shortly. Your lot is truly beautiful, since our Lord chose it for himself, and first put his own lips to the cup, which he now holds up to yours. The greatest honor that God can pay to anyone is not to give him much, but to ask much from him. In other words, the Lord is sharing his cup with his close friends, just like he did with his apostles. Can you drink of the cup of which I have to drink? So she says to her brother priest, and I think to all of us, let us work together for the salvation of souls. We have only one day of this life to save them, and thus to give our Lord some proof of our love. The tomorrow of this day will be eternity, when Jesus will reward you with the 100-fold of those sweet and lawful joys which you are giving up for him now. Yes, she goes on to speak another occasion. Yes, my beloved, this is how my life will be consumed. I have no other means of proving my love for you other than that of strewing flowers. That is, not allowing one little sacrifice to escape, not one look, one word, profiting by all the smallest things and doing them through love. I desire to suffer for love and even to rejoice through love. And in this way I shall strew flowers before your throne. I shall not come upon one sacrifice without unpedaling it for you. Her sister Celine, I'll close with this. Her sister Celine was under her direction as assistant novice mistress, and her sister Celine was very much tempted before she made her religious profession, which is binding, with fatigue. She says, "I was worn out with fatigue and harassed with spiritual worries. That night before meditation, I wanted to speak to her sister, St. Therese, but she dismissed me with the remark, 'That is the bell for meditation, and I have not time to console.'" You see, she could be firm. She could be firm. The little way is not enabling. It's charitable, but it's not enabling, and sometimes it's hard to see the difference. Pray for the grace to see the difference. Besides, I see plainly that it would be useless trouble. For the present, God wishes you to suffer alone. I followed her to meditation. That means they went in before the Blessed Sacrament. So discouraged that for the first time I doubted my vocation. I should never be able to be a Carmelite. This life is too hard. I had been kneeling for some minutes when all at once, in the midst of this interior struggle, without having asked or even wished for peace, I felt a sudden, extraordinary change of soul. I no longer knew myself. My vocation appeared to me both lovely and lovable. I saw the sweetness and priceless value of suffering. All the privations and fatigues of the religious life appeared, and we could say this about our lives too, appeared to me infinitely preferable to worldly pleasures, and I came away from my meditation completely transformed. The next day, I told my mistress, that's her sister, St. Therese, what had taken place. And seeing she was deeply touched, I begged to know the reason. "God is good," she exclaimed. "Last evening, you inspired me with such profound pity that I prayed incessantly for you at the beginning of my meditation. I besought our Lord to bring you comfort, to change your dispositions, and show you the value of suffering. He has indeed heard my prayers." Later on, asked under what name we should pray to her in heaven, she answered humbly, "Call me Little Therese."
Spend a couple of minutes in prayer before our Lord, asking for the graces to internalize what we've heard this evening, and we need to abandon ourselves to God's will in our daily sufferings and our crosses.